So Queen Elizabeth II spent 70 glorious years on the throne, basically ignoring some of the most stunning, historically significant jewelry in the world. And for a long time, royal historians and commentators simply thought she just didn't like the pieces. Or perhaps they were broken. Or maybe she was just hoarding them in the vault because she could. But now that we are actively watching the Princess of Wales, Catherine, step into her elevated role with absolute full force, the real calculated story is finally coming out, and it's actually way more fascinating and strategic than anyone ever assumed. It turns out Queen Elizabeth wasn't ignoring these incredible pieces at all, she was saving them. She was playing an incredibly long, brilliant game, where certain tiaras, necklaces, and earrings were deemed just too romantic, too modern, or too heavy with complicated history for her specific era. They didn't fit the rigid, stoic image she desperately needed to project as a steady, unchanging monarch for 7 decades. So she locked them away, deliberately skipped a generation, and sometimes even 2, so they could wake up nearly 100 years later perfectly resting on the one woman she truly believed was destined to wear them. And if you look closely at what's happened with the royal vault since Catherine officially joined the family, the strategic pattern is actually undeniable. Before we dive deep into the vault and unlock these secrets, if you love analytical deep dives into royal history and hidden strategies like this, hit subscribe to Monarch Access so you never miss what comes next. Let's start with the absolute biggest mystery of all. The one specific piece that had elite jewelry experts utterly convinced a literal masterpiece had been tragically destroyed. For decades, this particular tiara was basically a ghost. Grainy black and white photos from the 1920s existed, and then nothing but total, deafening silence. Most people in my field had grimly, sadly accepted that it had been dismantled, sold off privately, or broken down to make something entirely new. I'm talking about the legendary Strathmore rose tiara. Its story starts back in 1923, when Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, who we all eventually knew and loved as the Queen Mother, was getting ready to marry the Duke of York. She was young, fresh-faced, not born to be a queen, but absolutely historically destined to become one. Her father, the Earl of Strathmore, wanted to give her a wedding gift that actually reflected who she was as a person. Something soft, floral, and deeply romantic. So he commissioned this stunning garland of wild roses, intricately woven in diamonds. It was a total undisputed masterpiece of 1920s design. And the coolest part is that it could be worn 2 distinct ways, low across the forehead in that very trendy flapper bandeau style, or high on the head like a more traditional crown. The young Duchess absolutely loved it, and she wore it constantly in those early happy years before the devastating abdication crisis changed absolutely everything, and her husband suddenly became king. But by the 1930s, once she was officially elevated to queen consort, the delicate flowers disappeared from public view. She desperately needed grander, taller, much more imperial diadems to project authority, so the wild roses got packed away. When Queen Elizabeth II inherited the entire staggering collection, she had unlimited access to this beautiful piece for 70 years. 70 years of lavish state banquets, diplomatic galas, and official portraits, and she never wore it. Not even once. Why? Because Elizabeth II was fundamentally a monarch of structure and unyielding tradition. Her personal style was highly regal, imposing, and geometric. A delicate, flirty floral garland from the roaring 1920s simply didn't fit the imposing image of the sovereign she had painstakingly built. So, the Strathmore rose slept in the dark. It slept through the terrifying Blitz. It slept through the swinging 60s. And it slept through the entire chaotic Diana era, all the way until November 2023. That's when Catherine, the newly minted Princess of Wales, stepped out of her car at Buckingham Palace for the highly anticipated South Korean state banquet. And a collective gasp went through the entire global community of royal watchers. There, resting perfectly on her dark hair, was the ghost, the Strathmore rose, completely undamaged, absolutely perfect, looking like it had been made yesterday specifically, exclusively for her. The deep symbolism here is actually shattering when you truly think about it. Catherine, exactly like the beloved Queen Mother, was not born royal. She is an English rose who married into the ancient family. By deliberately lending her this specific, highly symbolic tiara, a piece literally unseen by the public for a century, King Charles was sending a massive historical message that could not possibly be clearer. This wasn't just a simple jewelry loan, it was a resurrection. The late Queen had purposefully kept this floral masterpiece safe in the dark for the one woman who could wear it effortlessly, without looking like she was just playing dress-up in the archives. It completely skipped the monarch, it skipped Princess Margaret, it skipped Princess Anne, and it waited a full 100 years to finally find its perfect match. If the Strathmore rose beautifully represents romance and softness, the next hidden treasure represents something totally different: raw, unadulterated power, and maybe a heavy burden that Queen Elizabeth II decided was simply too much for her own shoulders alone. We forget sometimes that when Princess Elizabeth married Prince Philip in 1947, Britain was still deeply suffering and recovering from the utter devastation of World War II. Austerity, severe rationing, and painful rebuilding, that was the daily reality. But in India, one incredibly powerful man lived in a reality entirely untouched by any of that post-war scarcity. The Nizam of Hyderabad was arguably the absolute richest man in the entire world at that time. When the future Queen of England announced her royal engagement, he didn't just send a polite gift, he essentially sent a blank check. Well, the jewelry equivalent of one. His explicit instruction to Cartier in London was incredibly simple: let the princess choose whatever she wants. Imagine standing in the luxurious Cartier showroom in 1947 with that kind of unlimited permission. Princess Elizabeth confidently chose a piece of floral magnificence, a necklace of such incredibly intricate platinum lacework and blinding, massive diamonds, that it looked significantly less like jewelry and more like a frozen waterfall. It features a stunning detachable double-drop pendant and 13 massive emerald-cut diamonds. This is the legendary Nizam of Hyderabad necklace, and today it is widely considered by experts to be the absolute most valuable necklace in the entire private royal collection. Conservative estimates put its staggering value well into the tens of millions of pounds. As a young woman, the new queen wore it quite frequently. It was the ultimate, undeniable symbol of majesty and wealth in the 1950s. We have those iconic, stunning portraits of her looking young and incredibly regal, with this literal river of diamonds cascading down her neck. But then, a very strange thing happened. As the decades wore on and the world changed, the necklace began to slowly disappear from her rotation. By the latter half of her long reign, the queen had almost entirely stopped wearing it in public. Why? Some historians say it was simply physically too heavy for an aging monarch. Others suggest that in a modern, democratic era, frequently wearing the absolute richest man in the world's lavish gift felt far too ostentatious, too disconnected from the daily struggles of her people. It was a heavy piece of empire, a glaring piece of excess, and so, exactly like the Strathmore rose, it retreated into the dark vault until 2014. That's when Catherine, then the Duchess of Cambridge, arrived at the National Portrait Gallery for her very first major engagement of the year. And the flashing cameras illuminated something truly shocking. She wasn't wearing a minor loan from the main collection. She wasn't wearing her usual pearls. She was wearing the Nizam. This wasn't just a fun fashion choice. This was a massive, undeniable statement of supreme trust from the monarch. You see, you absolutely do not lend the most valuable, historically significant item in your entire vault to just anyone. You don't hand over a piece of history worth a small country's GDP unless you are absolutely, unequivocally certain of the woman wearing it. By purposefully placing this specific heavy necklace around Catherine's neck, the Queen was doing vastly more than just accessorizing her granddaughter-in-law for a gala. She was publicly validating her. She was explicitly saying to the world, "You are worthy of carrying the crown's heaviest burdens." Elizabeth had put the massive necklace aside because it belonged to a completely different bygone age, but she brought it out specifically for Catherine to boldly show that the future of the monarchy would still sparkle with the exact same intensity and power. But while the Nizam necklace speaks loudly of trust, the next story speaks of something sharper. A distinct personal preference, or honestly, a strong personal dislike that inadvertently created one of Catherine's absolute most iconic, defining looks. Jewelry is inherently deeply personal. It physically touches the skin. It rests heavily against the pulse. And just like any of us, a reigning queen has certain things she simply cannot stand wearing. For Elizabeth II, that intense dislike was directed at the choker. Throughout her entire life, Her Majesty strongly favored necklaces that sat much lower on the chest, allowing for breathing room and comfort. She famously found tight, high collars incredibly uncomfortable and restricting. Yet in the 1970s, during an important state visit to Japan, she was presented with a magnificent set of the absolute finest cultured pearls the world had ever seen. Strict diplomatic protocol demanded they be used and seen. So, the Queen dutifully commissioned Garrett to create a stunning 4-strand pearl choker secured with a beautifully curved diamond clasp. It was an absolute masterpiece of minimalist, elegant design. She wore it perhaps once or twice out of strict diplomatic duty, and then, entirely true to her practical nature, she banished it straight to the back of the jewelry box. It simply wasn't her style. This easily could have been the sad end of the story for a beautiful object created for a queen who simply didn't want it. But then came Diana. In 1982, the Queen loaned the completely unloved choker to the dazzling new Princess of Wales, and on Diana's long, incredibly elegant neck, the piece entirely transformed. It ceased to be a constricting, uncomfortable collar and instantly became a massive symbol of 80s royal glamour. It was electric. However, after Diana's highly public divorce and tragic death, the choker became effectively radioactive within the palace. It was far too closely linked to the messy past, to the tabloid drama, and to the immense pain. It went straight back into the dark vault, arguably buried deeper than ever before. It took an entirely new generation to finally break the curse. When Catherine first wore it to the Queen and Prince Philip's 70th wedding anniversary dinner in 2017, it was seen as a polite, respectful nod to history. But the choker's true profound destiny was revealed in moments of immense national sorrow. April 2021, the solemn funeral of Prince Philip. That specific image is permanently burned into our collective memory. Catherine sitting quietly in the back of a black car, masked, her eyes looking fierce and resolute, and right at her throat, the famous Japanese pearl choker. Then again in September 2022, for the massive state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II, Catherine once again deliberately reached for this specific piece. Why? Because Catherine fundamentally understood what the Queen never felt. She understood that a tight choker acts as a form of armor. It physically forces you to hold the head high, it protects the throat. In those immense moments of global national grief, Catherine wasn't just wearing pretty pearls. She was wearing a highly visible symbol of royal stoicism. She took a piece the Queen actively disliked for its tightness. And she brilliantly used that very specific quality to show the entire watching world that the monarchy was holding it together. She masterfully turned a rejected diplomatic gift into the undeniable uniform of a future queen. But pearls are traditionally for mourning. What about the dazzling pieces that were meant for absolute joy, yet were completely ignored by the Queen all the same? Let's look closely at a pair of earrings that perfectly capture the glittering glamour of the Jazz Age and the Queen's utter baffling refusal to wear them. If you look closely at Catherine's curated style over the last decade, you will undoubtedly notice a very distinct pattern. She heavily gravitates toward the geometric, the bold, and the architectural. She absolutely loves Art Deco design, and sitting quietly in the royal vault, there was a pair of earrings that were the very definition of Art Deco perfection. Yet for some unknown reason, Queen Elizabeth II entirely pretended they didn't exist. These are the spectacular Queen Mother's sapphire and diamond fringe earrings. Just picture them, a deep, velvety, massive sapphire completely surrounded by diamonds, from which falls a stunning cascade, a literal fringe of baguette and round diamonds. They swing beautifully when you move. They catch the light with a dynamic rhythm that is pure 1920s jazz. They were incredibly daring, flirty, and dramatic. The Queen Mother absolutely adored them. She wore them to flashy theater premieres, to intimate private dinners, and to moments where she wanted to sparkle with a bit of a modern edge. But when she sadly died in 2002 and her daughter Elizabeth inherited them, total silence fell. For 13 long years, these magnificent earrings were nowhere to be seen. The Queen, with her distinctly more conservative, structured taste, likely found them far too loud, too highly mobile, and perhaps too frivolous for a reigning monarch in her 80s. They were entirely destined to become just another inventory number forgotten in a velvet drawer. But the vault has a funny way of patiently waiting. In 2015, at a glittering gala for the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Duchess of Cambridge stepped out, and there they were. The diamond fringes were finally dancing again. The match was absolutely instantaneous. Catherine has famously made the deep blue sapphire her ultimate signature stone, heavily anchored, of course, by Princess Diana's iconic engagement ring. These earrings didn't just casually suit her, they completely completed her. They brilliantly bridged the historical gap between the ring on her finger and the legacy of the Queen Mother. Since that stunning debut, they have become one of Catherine's ultimate power pairs. She wears them exactly when she needs to project sleek, modern glamour, not ancient, stuffy beauty. By actively reviving them, she proves something incredibly important, that the Queen's rejected pieces were simply waiting for a woman with the exact right style to unlock their true potential. Now, we absolutely have to talk about a wedding, but not just any wedding, the wedding that fundamentally changed the entire course of the modern monarchy. When Kate Middleton walked down the aisle at Westminster Abbey in 2011, the world was actively placing bets. Would she wear the famous lover's knot, a simple flower crown, or a brand new modern commission? When the veil was finally lifted, what we all saw was the exquisite Cartier halo tiara. It was relatively small, incredibly precise, and unbelievably brilliant. A literal halo of light hovering perfectly over her. But the deeply hidden story behind this specific choice is an absolute masterclass in the Queen's long game. This tiara was made in 1936. It was purchased by King George VI for his wife right before he unexpectedly became king. In 1944, it was generously given to Princess Elizabeth as an 18th birthday present. Think about that for a second, an 18th birthday present. It was her very first tiara, and yet she never ever wore it publicly, not even once. For a young princess in austere, wartime Britain, perhaps there were simply no appropriate occasions, but even later as queen, she entirely ignored it. She loaned it briefly to her sister Margaret, who wore it quite often in her wild, partying youth, and then later to her daughter Anne. But by the 1970s, the halo had completely vanished from sight. For 40 long years, this beautiful tiara sat alone in the dark. It was deemed too small for the massive, voluminous hair of the 80s and too modest for the ostentatious bling of the 90s. It was essentially considered a relic. So, why on earth did the Queen deliberately offer this specific, forgotten piece to Catherine for the absolute biggest, most photographed day of her life? Because the Queen was a brilliant curator. She knew that the halo tiara had absolutely zero negative baggage. It hadn't been heavily worn and defined by Diana. It wasn't tainted by any royal scandal or tragedy. It was pure. It was an innocent 18th birthday gift that had never truly fulfilled its ultimate destiny. By giving it to Catherine, the Queen was offering her a completely clean slate, a fresh, unburdened start. It was a tiara that had patiently waited through 3 distinct generations of Windsor women just to finally find the one commoner who would make it globally iconic. The Queen didn't wear it because she simply didn't need a halo. She was the sovereign. But she astutely knew that for the young, relatable woman marrying her grandson, a sparkling halo was exactly what the British public desperately wanted to see. Sometimes the absolute most treasured pieces in the collection are the ones that quietly whisper rather than loudly shout. In the vast sprawling collection of the Queen, there was a pair of floral diamond earrings, a simple, elegant stud from which hangs an open diamond frame with 4 beautifully graduated stones inside. They are incredibly elegant, wonderfully understated, and perfectly timeless. They have been securely in the royal collection for years. But if you painstakingly search the extensive photo archives for images of Queen Elizabeth actually wearing them, you will be searching for a very long time. She wore them perhaps twice in her entire reign. Once for the highly formal state opening of Parliament in 2012, and once for Garter Day. That's it. To the Queen, these were clearly just filler earrings, nice to have in the collection, but absolutely not essential, not favorites. But to Catherine, they are utterly essential. Since the Queen quietly loaned them to her in 2016, Catherine has worn these previously ignored diamonds dozens of times. To major royal weddings, to trooping the color, to highly visible official portraits. Why the stark difference in usage? Because Catherine fundamentally understands the immense power of the everyday royal uniform. The Queen's style was all about the grand occasion. Massive brooches, huge heavy pearls. Catherine's modern style is entirely about reliability and approachability. These earrings are undeniably luxurious, yes, but they absolutely aren't intimidating. They don't scream, "I am the untouchable monarch." They quietly say, "I am working." It is a subtle visual shift, but a profoundly important one. Catherine took a pair of earrings that literally sat at the very bottom of the Queen's jewelry box and brilliantly elevated them to the high status of a future Queen's daily signature. She expertly found immense value exactly where Elizabeth saw only basic utility. But if those diamond earrings beautifully represent quiet, steadfast duty, the next piece represents the much wilder, untamed side of royalty, the specific side Elizabeth tried very, very hard to constantly suppress. If the Cartier halo was the ultimate tiara of innocence, the lotus flower is unequivocally the tiara of the party princess. And for decades, that chaotic energy was something Queen Elizabeth II kept firmly, deliberately at arm's length. The story of this piece is a fascinating tale of destruction and rebirth. It actually began its life as a necklace, a lavish wedding gift to the Queen Mother in 1923, but she quickly found it too heavy and aesthetically uninspired. So, within just 6 months, she boldly marched right back into Garrett in order them to smash it completely apart. From that expensive wreckage emerged this, the lotus flower tiara. Egyptian-inspired, very low profile, and utterly undeniably chic. But it wasn't the Queen Mother who ultimately made it famous, it was Princess Margaret. In the swinging 1960s, Margaret was the ultimate royal rebel. She famously wore this tiara lounging in the bath. She wore it out to wild, late-night parties. She wore it with her hair piled impossibly high and her eyeliner painted thick. The lotus flower quickly became completely synonymous with the scandalous, unpredictable side of the Windsors. When Margaret passed away in 2002, the tiara was returned to the main vault, and the Queen immediately, effectively buried it. For Elizabeth II, this specific tiara likely carried far too many difficult memories of her sister's highly turbulent, deeply public life. It was considered too Hollywood, too flashy. It absolutely didn't fit the steady, stoic, reliable image of the monarch. So it completely disappeared until 2013, when Catherine shocked everyone by wearing it to the highly formal annual diplomatic reception. It was a massive shock to the system. Why would the famously sensible, pitch-perfect Kate Middleton deliberately choose Margaret's notorious party tiara? Because Catherine was brilliantly making a point. She was visually showing that she could absolutely handle the glamour. She could wear the rebel's crown and make it look entirely regal, not reckless. And when she wore it again in 2022 with that incredibly sleek, straight, modern hairstyle, she fully, permanently reclaimed it. She expertly stripped away all the messy 60s drama and revealed the tiara's true, stunning Art Deco beauty. The Queen had hidden it away in the dark to protect the family's conservative image. Catherine brought it back to enhance it. We've talked extensively about the Queen's intense dislike of tight chokers, but here is a piece that proves exactly just how deep that aversion really went, and exactly how much Catherine fiercely disagrees. This is Queen Mary's Art Deco diamond choker. It is an absolute masterpiece of geometric design, heavy bars of diamonds, clean, sharp lines, pure modernist luxury. It was specifically designed to be worn very tight against the throat, a bold style Queen Mary absolutely adored in the roaring 1920s. However, exactly like many of Mary's ingenious pieces, It was a transformer. It could be easily converted into a dazzling bracelet. When Elizabeth inherited it, she had very clear options. She could have worn it as a choker, which was physically impossible for her comfort. She could have easily worn it as a bracelet, but she did neither. For over 50 years, this magnificent piece sat entirely untouched in the dark. It was deemed too angular, too hard, and too severe for the Queen's much softer, more floral traditional taste. It was viewed as a harsh relic of a severe grandmother. But Catherine absolutely loves architectural structure. In 2015, the Queen finally unlocked the vault and handed this heavy piece to the Duchess of Cambridge, but crucially not to be worn as a choker. Catherine wears it as a bracelet, a wide, dazzling, armor-like cuff of solid diamonds. It has quickly become her absolute go-to piece for highly formal state banquets. Why? Because it visually functions as armor. It is incredibly heavy, it is incredibly substantial, and it speaks volumes of unyielding strength. The Queen looked at it and saw a constricting choker she couldn't comfortably wear. Catherine looked at it and saw a Wonder Woman cuff that she simply couldn't live without. It is yet another brilliant example of exactly how the two women view jewelry fundamentally differently. Elizabeth saw heavy history, Catherine sees modern utility and high fashion. While the emerald choker was technically a loan, the next pair of earrings was a highly personal gift, and their emotional journey to Catherine is perhaps the most deeply touching of all. The Collingwood pearl earrings were generously given to Diana as a wedding gift by the elite Collingwood jewelers. They are absolute classic, elegant teardrop pearls perfectly suspended from diamonds. Diana loved them and wore them constantly, but after the bitter divorce and then the horrific tragedy in Paris, these earrings entered a very strange legal and emotional limbo. They were her personal property, not official crown jewels. They rightfully belonged to William and Harry. For years they sat quietly in a private safe, a heavy reminder of a mother lost far too soon. When Catherine finally began wearing them, it was a quiet, beautiful revelation. She didn't make a loud press announcement, she just started wearing them to ordinary school runs, to afternoon garden parties, to official overseas tours. She seamlessly made them a part of her daily life. The Queen, of course, had her own vast collection of pearls. She absolutely didn't need Diana's. But for Catherine, these earrings are a vital physical link to the mother-in-law she tragically never met. By wearing them constantly, she ensures that Diana is visually present at every single major royal milestone: christenings, royal weddings, jubilees. They didn't skip the Queen because the Queen didn't want them. They skipped her because they fundamentally belong to an entirely different bloodline. They belong exclusively to the line of William. And Catherine is now the fierce, protective custodian of that memory. There is one major, highly significant category of jewels that Catherine is just now beginning to deeply explore: the sapphires. And there is one very specific, legendary ghost in the vault that seems absolutely destined for her next. We have to talk about Empress Maria Fyodorovna's sapphire choker. This breathtaking jewel is a literal survivor. It miraculously escaped the bloody Russian Revolution. It traveled secretly in a pocket, smuggled desperately out of a crumbling empire before eventually finding its way to Queen Mary. It features a massive geometric diamond and sapphire placket center, beautifully strung on multiple rows of pearls. Queen Elizabeth inherited it, but predictably never wore it as a choker. She wore it very briefly as a bracelet, then entirely abandoned it. Currently, it is occasionally seen on Princess Anne, but here is the fascinating theory currently gaining massive traction among royal historians. Catherine has brilliantly built her entire royal identity around the sapphire, her iconic engagement ring, the fringed earrings, the necklace pieces. She is undeniably the sapphire princess. Princess Anne is the hardest working royal, but she is entering her 70s. As the monumental role of the Princess of Wales inevitably grows, we are seeing a natural, strategic migration of jewels. This choker, with its deep blue center and elegant pearl strands, sits at the exact perfect intersection of Catherine's entire style. Chokers plus sapphires. It is the ultimate missing link. The Queen kept it safely in the family, but she never made it a defining crown piece. It currently floats. And as Catherine steps further and further into her massive role as the future Queen consort, many experts firmly believe this incredible Russian survivor is just patiently waiting for her call. It has the immense drama, the heavy history, and the exact color palette that Catherine has fiercely claimed as her own. It is a piece that is currently awake on Anne, but perhaps quietly dreaming of a much grander future with Catherine. And finally, we arrive at the ultimate sleeping beauty, the one spectacular piece that brings our entire story perfectly full circle: the Indian circle. We mentioned earlier that this magnificent tiara, originally designed by Prince Albert specifically for Queen Victoria, was deeply loved by the Queen Mother, but entirely, bafflingly ignored by Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen wore it exactly once during a trip to Malta, and then let it completely fade into obscurity in the vault. Why? Because the Indian circle is an official crown heirloom. But the deeply hidden story behind this specific choice is an absolute masterclass in the Queen's long game. This tiara was made in 1936. It was purchased by King George VI for his wife right before he unexpectedly became king. In 1944, it was generously given to Princess Elizabeth as an 18th birthday present. Think about that for a second, an 18th birthday present. It was her very first tiara, and yet she never ever wore it publicly, not even once. For a young princess in austere, wartime Britain, perhaps there were simply no appropriate occasions, but even later as queen, she entirely ignored it. She loaned it briefly to her sister Margaret, who wore it quite often in her wild, partying youth, and then later to her daughter Anne. But by the 1970s, the halo had completely vanished from sight. For 40 long years, this beautiful tiara sat alone in the dark. It was deemed too small for the massive, voluminous hair of the 80s and too modest for the ostentatious bling of the 90s. It was essentially considered a relic. So, why on earth did the Queen deliberately offer this specific, forgotten piece to Catherine for the absolute biggest, most photographed day of her life? Because the Queen was a brilliant curator. She knew that the halo tiara had absolutely zero negative baggage. It hadn't been heavily worn and defined by Diana. It wasn't tainted by any royal scandal or tragedy. It was pure. It was an innocent 18th birthday gift that had never truly fulfilled its ultimate destiny. By giving it to Catherine, the Queen was offering her a completely clean slate, a fresh, unburdened start. It was a tiara that had patiently waited through 3 distinct generations of Windsor women just to finally find the one commoner who would make it globally iconic. The Queen didn't wear it because she simply didn't need a halo. She was the sovereign. But the deeply hidden story behind this specific choice is an absolute masterclass in the Queen's long game. This tiara was made in 1936. It was purchased by King George VI for his wife right before he unexpectedly became king. In 1944, it was generously given to Princess Elizabeth as an 18th birthday present. Think about that for a second, an 18th birthday present. It was her very first tiara, and yet she never ever wore it publicly, not even once. For a young princess in austere, wartime Britain, perhaps there were simply no appropriate occasions, but even later as queen, she entirely ignored it. She loaned it briefly to her sister Margaret, who wore it quite often in her wild, partying youth, and then later to her daughter Anne. But by the 1970s, the halo had completely vanished from sight. For 40 long years, this beautiful tiara sat alone in the dark. It was deemed too small for the massive, voluminous hair of the 80s and too modest for the ostentatious bling of the 90s. It was essentially considered a relic. So, why on earth did the Queen deliberately offer this specific, forgotten piece to Catherine for the absolute biggest, most photographed day of her life? Because the Queen was a brilliant curator. She knew that the halo tiara had absolutely zero negative baggage. It hadn't been heavily worn and defined by Diana. It wasn't tainted by any royal scandal or tragedy. It was pure. It was an innocent 18th birthday gift that had never truly fulfilled its ultimate destiny. By giving it to Catherine, the Queen was offering her a completely clean slate, a fresh, unburdened start. It was a tiara that had patiently waited through 3 distinct generations of Windsor women just to finally find the one commoner who would make it globally iconic. The Queen didn't wear it because she simply didn't need a halo. She was the sovereign. But the deeply hidden story behind this specific choice is an absolute masterclass in the Queen's long game. This tiara was made in 1936. It was purchased by King George VI for his wife right before he unexpectedly became king. In 1944, it was generously given to Princess Elizabeth as an 18th birthday present. Think about that for a second, an 18th birthday present. It was her very first tiara, and yet she never ever wore it publicly, not even once. For a young princess in austere, wartime Britain, perhaps there were simply no appropriate occasions, but even later as queen, she entirely ignored it. She loaned it briefly to her sister Margaret, who wore it quite often in her wild, partying youth, and then later to her daughter Anne. But by the 1970s, the halo had completely vanished from sight. For 40 long years, this beautiful tiara sat alone in the dark. It was deemed too small for the massive, voluminous hair of the 80s and too modest for the ostentatious bling of the 90s. It was essentially considered a relic. So, why on earth did the Queen deliberately offer this specific, forgotten piece to Catherine for the absolute biggest, most photographed day of her life? Because the Queen was a brilliant curator. She knew that the halo tiara had absolutely zero negative baggage. It hadn't been heavily worn and defined by Diana. It wasn't tainted by any royal scandal or tragedy. It was pure. It was an innocent 18th birthday gift that had never truly fulfilled its ultimate destiny. By giving it to Catherine, the Queen was offering her a completely clean slate, a fresh, unburdened start. It was a tiara that had patiently waited through 3 distinct generations of Windsor women just to finally find the one commoner who would make it globally iconic. The Queen didn't wear it because she simply didn't need a halo. She was the sovereign.